wintry day that the days that just continue to come and come, all these chilly days. But I just wanted to make a quick announcement. In the back, as you probably already noticed, we've got some light snacks, some coffee and tea, so please feel free to help yourself. There's also some brochures in the corner there. We have a copy of the list of all the rest of the lunchtime lectures that we have for the remainder of the semester. Those are available, and also a listserv sign-in sheet if you're not on our listserv and you'd like to stay abreast of all of our events. There's also a handout there for a conference that's coming up that has to do with Brazil, and that's through our linkage with the Brazil Initiative project, and so that is available. So thank you very much for coming. I'll turn it over to Dr. Dr.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Daniel Friedrich. Daniel got his PhD here in campus in curriculum and instruction, and also with a minor in Latin American studies. So it's great to have alums coming back and presenting us to see what they're doing. Daniel is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching in the Teachers College at Columbia University. Learned that he just received an Early Career Scholar Award from the American Educational Research Association, their special interest group on critical issues in curriculum and cultural studies. So congratulations on that award. Daniel's interest is in the systems of thought that travel in teacher education and the political of the knowledge of education. His talk today is titled Democratic Education as a Curricular Problem, Memory, History, and Teaching in Post-Dictatorship Argentina. Daniel also published a book. The title of the book is Democratic Education as a Curricular Problem. It was published by Routledge in 2013. So with that, I just want to welcome Daniel and we'll hear what he said. He's going to talk about 40 minutes and then we'll have time for discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the LACIS program and CNI for sponsoring my visit. I said this yesterday in the lecture I gave in CNI, but it's very special to come back, right? I wrote basically what would become this book, which was at the time my dissertation here. I finished in 2010. One of the courses that mostly inspired my research was the one I took with Xenia. Tom Popkowitz is my advisor. So it's very special. It's very different to present here than anywhere else. So thanks for coming. So yesterday's talk focused mostly on the curricular issues because most people there were not necessarily interested in Latin America. So today's talk, I thought of doing something that merged those curricular interests with some of the things that are going on in Argentina as I see them in terms of how the dictatorship, the period of the dictatorship from the late 70s and early 80s is being taught and talked about right now. But I want to start with a little anecdote that shaped part of how I was seeing the problem at stake. And it has to do with when I went back to Argentina to do my field work in 2008, I was walking with my dad, and for the first time, I was almost 30 years old, and for the first time, I asked him, how come you, like most of the middle class in Buenos Aires, how come you lived through all that, and you still claim you had no idea what was going on? What was going, like, how could it be that 30,000 people were disappeared, tortured, and killed? The largest urban concentration camp in the country was 15 blocks from your house, and you still claim that you only found this out after the trials in '83. And his response, I mean, and I consider my dad as very, very smart guy, very progressive guy, and his response really shifted the way I was thinking of this dissertation. His response was, look, I was born in Bolivia, then I moved to Chile, then I moved to Argentina, and until 1983, except for 2 years in Chile, I never lived in a democracy. So in Bolivia, my childhood was coup after coup after coup after coup. In Chile, I lived 2 years in democracy, then Pinochet's coup, and then I moved to Argentina in '78 in the middle of the military dictatorship. So for me, seeing people in civilian clothes with guns, grabbing people and putting them in the cars and driving away, looking over my shoulder, that was normal. That was how you live. It wasn't that I didn't know. What I didn't know, that was not what was supposed to happen, right? And that response really shifted the way I was thinking of the problem, which I'm going to talk in a second, because that what made me think is, so what is it that we now consider normal? What is it how in the ways we live that we now consider something that is normal, that in 20 or 30 years, our kids are going to ask us, how come you didn't see this? How come this happened and you had no clue? So that's part of how I'm trying to frame this conversation. What are the things that are going on pedagogically, but not only, related to dictatorship, that now for us are how things are supposed to be, that now for us are the common sense, but that we should step back and try to think about more carefully. So more specifically, the book tries to deal with the shifts that have taken and are taking place in the pedagogical production of a citizen in Argentina in the last 20 years as related to last military dictatorship. And it has to do with the other step, the other part of anecdotal part that has to do with when I went to school in Argentina during my high school, which happened only in the early 90s and up to the mid-90s, we never touched upon dictatorship. Dictatorship was really not part of the curriculum, and this is an experience shared with most people I know in my age range. However, when I was a teacher there in the early 2000s, dictatorship had moved to the core of the curricula. In every subject area, in every grade, I was an elementary school teacher, we were supposed to talk about dictatorship. People were supposed to read particular books because they were banning dictatorship. People were supposed to do certain things because they were. So in a way, there was a shift that moved dictatorship to the center of the curriculum. And that's what triggered my interest. What's going on? How is it that dictatorship is being used to define what a citizen is, always in opposition? So what are those shifts that took place? And again, what is the normal now? So then after that very general problem, and I'm sorry for people that were there yesterday, this is a general introduction that I did yesterday too, I started opening up to think through which governing mechanisms and strategies does the production of citizenship, the citizen takes place. What role do historical narratives play in the pedagogical production of a citizen? What is the common sense or the foundations ordering the pedagogical thought and action related to this? And finally, this is kind of the invitation at the end of the book, what happens when the foundations get suspended? What happens when we stop assuming what is common sense to be common sense? What are the possibilities that are being opened up? In terms of the general theoretical framework of the work, I'm going to go sort of quickly through this because I really want to get to the specifics of the Argentinian cases. I understand the citizen as a technology of government. The citizen is not something natural out there, but it's a way of governing people and in way of producing a particular subjectivity in ways of what is possible to think and act upon. So within the big framework for Foucauldian studies, it's understanding governing not as a unidirectional power that oppresses people, but as all efforts aimed at shaping, guiding, and directing the conducts of others and the self. So within that, the idea of governmentality is about the positive production of notions such as freedom, agency, creativity, responsibility, citizenship. How are those notions possible and intelligible? So again, it's not taking those for granted, but seeing how they are produced through different discursive practices. So within that framework, the citizen, as I said, as technology government, is the subject that uses freedom in reasonable ways, that can work his or her own way through problems by trusting own reasoning, established knowledge, and the power of expertise. And that possesses, and this is a key component of my research, that possesses a historical consciousness that guides thought and action in terms of loyalty to a project or nation. That is, it's a subject that is able to position him or herself within a historical narrative, that sees that narrative as his own narrative, and then acts according to lessons learned from that past. That's how the responsible citizen is defined within this framework. So this notion of historical consciousness, and that's what I focused on yesterday, plays a key role in dissertation. Because it's a notion that although it's more present in Latin America and in Europe, you can still read through it in the case of American curriculum as well. And it's basically what it is this idea that we learn history in order not to repeat it. That cliched statement. And that says that the role of history is to learn certain moral lessons that are inherently there, that if only people learn history, they'll automatically become better citizens. So some people that I draw from these people from the field of philosophy of history in the 60s come up with this notion of historical consciousness and define it as an inherent part of modernity, as something that we all have just for being modern. There is this possibility of seeing oneself as actors within the field of, within history, right? That see past as our own past and the future as guiding our actions. However, when it's translated into a pedagogical device, something else happens. It's taken not anymore as an actuality, as something that everyone has because of being modern, but it's something that is to be formed by good education. So suddenly, it's not about subjects positioning themselves in history, but it's some subjects being able to do that. So there's a distinction between those who can and those who can't, those who see history and the lessons in that history as part of the self, and those who don't learn the right lessons. So therefore, cannot become that responsible citizen. So it goes from being an actuality into a potentiality, something that can develop if one is subjected to the right kind of education. So this idea of historical consciousness is what helps people link their own past, present, and future within a singular narrative that positions him or herself within that narrative and that can use the past as a guideline for thought and action. So, and this is a very important process within education. It's the idea that we learn from the past to become better people. But that's also the idea that I want to question. The idea that the problem of history, the problem of the mistakes that we're not trying to repeat are because of a lack of education. As if reason was the unique way of getting salvation from those mistakes. And as if those moral lessons were inherently there in history, so the learning of history makes us better people. So within that framework, as I said, the responsible citizen becomes the subject who is able to position him or herself as part of a consensualized narrative about the past as a condition for the present, and then act according to lessons learned from that narrative. But as the work of many people, but among others, some populists tell us, the issue is that when we govern the citizen, there's always at the same time necessarily the protection of each other. Those who do not learn the right lessons, those who are not responsible, and those who pose a threat to democratic progress of the nation. So what I'm trying to do here is try to think about how in the name of democracy, we're producing its other that it's its own threat, right? And that in some of the mechanisms in which we try to defend this idea of democracy by teaching the right lessons, by wanting to arrive at a particular points, we are setting up certain mechanisms that look in some way similar to the mechanisms through which regimes like a dictatorship try to protect its own sense of nationhood, but this time in the name of democracy. So this is where the overlaps with yesterday's presentation, for those of you who were there, stop. And so I need to talk a little bit about the brief historical context of Argentina to talk about how this plays out in that particular context right now. And for those of you who are Latin Americans, this might sound a little bit redundant, but I have to go into this. So the last dictatorship, which took place between 76 and 83, is usually seen as, it's spoken as in Argentina as an interruption of the democratic order. And this particular way of seeing the dictatorship as an interruption of a democratic order plays a key role in what I'm saying, because what it assumes is that the natural order is democratic, Argentines are democratic, and there are interruptions to this order in the sense of its dictatorship. So in the early 90s, when I went through school, this problematic past was seen as a hindrance in order to look up for the future. So that's a period when the president of that time pardoned all the military and all the torturers, all the genocides, in order to move on, in order to forget about the past and look forward. So part of the reason why the dictatorship was not part of the curriculum was a particular view of the future, not needing to look back. But there's a shift that takes place in the 2000s that, and it's hard to pinpoint specific dates because things are processes that are more complex than that. But as a symbol, there's a crisis of 2001 that calls for every one of the politicians to leave. There's a big banking and political crisis that leads to 5 presidents in a matter of 3 months. And a big political shift in terms of how do we deal with the remains of the past? What happens now that we realize that we cannot just look forward without looking back. And within that last decade, especially since both Nestor and Cristina Kirchner came in power, there's a politics and a pedagogy of memory that are particular in the construction of Argentina, of what it means to be Argentine. And one thing that is important is, again, like there were efforts before. Clearly, the mothers were actors in the processes that had a much longer duration. In the city of Buenos Aires, there were the establishment of memorial sites that came before, but this is just a general marker of a shift, especially also in terms of curriculum. So within that context, what I do is, within 3 chapters, I analyze different genres of texts related to dictatorship to try to understand how the past is mobilized in order to construct this citizen. One of the genres is legislation and official curricular documents. A second genre, which I'm going to talk about now, is textbooks. And a third genre is memorial spaces. And I think I'm going to just talk about textbooks and memorial spaces because, as you will see with memorial spaces, the possibilities open up by looking at those spaces in different ways, push against the limits of how we consider pedagogy right now. By looking at the textbooks, something that's interesting is that when one looks at the textbooks that were published before the 20th anniversary of the coup in '96, first of all, not all texts included the dictatorship as a content to be taught. But also the other part is interesting, that up to the mid-90s, you can still find in some texts support for dictatorship. The explicit idea that dictatorship was a necessary process to battle the guerrilla, that to defend the national identity from the threat of the left, that it was a war, all that narrative that was very much part of the discourse of the dictatorship itself is still present in some textbooks up to the mid-90s. And after the 90s, something happened. After the mid-90s, something happens where there's a streamlining of the narrative. Suddenly, defending the dictatorship becomes taboo. A lot of people think that like that still, but it's not something that can be said out publicly, and definitely not something that can be included in the textbooks. There's a streamlining of the narrative and a particular way of understanding history that starts appearing throughout all the textbooks from the most varied kind of publishers. And the reason why all these narratives are being streamlined, and the reason given to why we should teach about the spirit also becomes streamlined, which is as a way of defending democratic historical consciousness. The idea of the value of democracy, everyone should learn how good democracy is, and in order to do that, we need to learn the horrors of dictatorship. But the paradox there is that in order to defend the values of democracies, there are clear limits in what can and cannot be said, what can and cannot be shown in those textbooks. Which I quote here from Rancière, are based in my notion of a hatred of democracy. What would happen if we actually let people think? What would happen if we actually don't tell them what they should learn, but we show them what they need to learn? A very illustrative example of this is there's one of the textbooks that has a photo of Galtieri, who was the last one of the generals to govern the country in dictatorship, right before the war with Britain in '82, where he's in the balcony and there's a huge mass of people supporting the war, right? And the epigraph of the photo says something like, 1982, the Falkland War is about to begin, and so is the end of the dictatorship. What is not there, and is not throughout the text, is what are those hundreds of thousands of people doing in the plaza, right? So how is it that the civic support of the dictatorship is never there in the narratives? Because that what presents is a problem, this idea of we as a people are inherently democratic, but we were taken over by this group, by this mentality, that suddenly after the war we woke up from, and we managed to kick them out. So some examples here are these two quotes that I have. So, today Argentine society maintains a difficult relationship with its recent past. It needs to appropriate it in order not to repeat it, and it's necessary to tell the story so that it never happens again. So it's again this idea that by telling it, it will never happen because there's a particular story we need to tell. So again, like one of the things I'm trying to do here is point to how this construction of the responsible citizen sets up limits on the possibilities of thought and action that would actually like represent a different notion of democracy. So the reason and knowledge act as salvation narratives. We need to learn these lessons in order not to repeat it, in order to guarantee, as if that were possible, the right way of acting in the future. But at the same time, by saying that we need to learn in order not to repeat it, what we're reporting is that the mistakes were done due to a lack of education, that other that is being constructed in terms of dictatorship is an other that is uneducated, that is unreasonable. When we know that many of the generals and those people were highly educated people in particular ways. The narratives that are being presented in the textbooks are a progressive narrative of the nation. There's a linear way in which the narrative about the past is being presented, in which there is social and political unrest in the early 70s, there's a coup in 76, repression and violence that leads to the Falkland War, and society wakes up and there's a democratic opening. So while this is the narrative that's presented throughout all the textbooks I analyzed, the questions that come up when one thinks of history as a progress of a democratic society that has interruptions is what happens to those things that don't fit that narrative of progress? What happens to those things that do not fit this particular way of seeing progress as, again, in the name of democracy? What is presented here is the idea of Argentines as being essentially democratic people that get deceived and then wake up. And the democratic education is seen as a preservation of this inherent democratic essence, as it's not a creative act of trying to think of what democracy means in the moment, but it means trying to protect ourselves from the threats of democracy that a democracy is already living within us. So what this progressive narrative of the nation tries to do is present us with a binary between authoritarianism and democracy. That sets a construction as a basis for construction of a distinction between us and them. Us, the democratic people, the people that always struggled for freedom, also the victims. Them, the fascists, the repressors. And what this makes very difficult is, again, the dialogue of continuities. So how is it that people were supporting the war like that? How is it that when the dictatorship came into being, after the coup, a large amount of population were supportive of them? There is an impossibility of talking about the conservative seeds in the thoughts of particular sectors of the country. And this is a conversation that's starting to emerge now in other areas, but in curriculum for elementary and middle school and high school are still very much on the fringes. So when there's an impossibility of talking about the continuities between what happened before dictatorship and after, the dictatorship appears as an ungraspable other, something that happened out of nowhere to us, and that suddenly we became free of, right? Because the dictatorship kind of interrupts that process, but that process is, again, the natural order. So here's an interesting quote that I find that help us think about this. So it says, "No sacrifice is too great for our democracy, least of all the temporary sacrifice of democracy itself." Right? The idea that in order to protect its democratic essence, we need to block certain narratives and certain ways of thinking out history in order that would threaten that democracy that we're trying to protect. So the question is, when the protection of democracy slowly starts to become what democracy is being protected against, the line between democracy and authoritarianism starts to become quite blurry. And to present a different kind of thinking, or the possibility of a different kind of thinking of pedagogy and of these spaces, I want to share with you a few images from the Parque de la Memoria, the Memory Park in Buenos Aires. Because what I think this space does is invite a different kind of thought about pedagogy and about what it means to think about responsibility and citizenship in terms that question what pedagogy means. So I'm going to share just with you a few images of the park. This is one of the sculptures in the park. this is a different part of the park, which is the monument where the names of the disappeared, that started a little bit before dictatorship and ends a little after, that marks the names, and also it has an indication of the women that were pregnant in the monument. But let me tell you a bit about this park. This park is, first of all, in some ways in the fringes of the city. It faces the river in a city that is said to be turning its back on the river. So it's an area where not many people live, where not many buses get to. But more important than that, it's a space that has no guides. It has no one telling, when you go into the park, you just circulate through the park. And there's no one telling you what lessons you should learn from this. There's no one telling you what the pedagogy of the space is supposed to be. It's just for any visitor to figure out. And you may not figure out anything. And you may, as you saw, some of the pieces of art are more abstract than others. And some of them can be said to represent the dictatorship only because they are in the memory park. If they were somewhere else, they would maybe be seen as something else. And what's a few things that are interesting about this place is, yesterday I compared it to the former concentration camp of ESMA, which is now a museum of memory, where you visit with a guide. And although the space is empty, the guide tries to, is all the time filling up those spaces with narratives and particular lessons to be learned. And how that museum is a place that many schools currently visit, but this is
and teaching in post-dictatorship Argentina. Danny also published a book. The title of the book is Democratic Education as a Curricular Problem. It was published by Routledge in 2013. So with that, I just want to welcome Daniel and we'll hear what he said. He's going to talk about 40 minutes and then we'll have time for discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the LACIS program and CNI for sponsoring my visit. I said this yesterday in the lecture I gave in CNI, but it's very special to come back, right? I wrote basically what would become this book, which was at the time my dissertation here. I finished in 2010. One of the courses that mostly inspired my research was the one I took with Xenia. Tom Popkowitz is my advisor, so it's very special. It's very different to present here than anywhere else, so thanks for coming. What was going, like, how could it be that 30,000 people were disappeared, tortured, and killed? The largest urban concentration camp in the country was 15 blocks from your house, and you still claim that you only found this out after the trials in '83. And his response, I mean, and I consider my dad as very, very smart guy, very progressive guy, and his response really shifted the way I was thinking of the dissertation. His response was, look, I was born in Bolivia, then I moved to Chile, then I moved to Argentina, and until 1983, except for 2 years in Chile, I never lived in a democracy. So in Bolivia, my childhood was coup after coup after coup after coup. In Chile, I lived 2 years in democracy, then Pinochet's coup, and then I moved to Argentina in '78 in the middle of the military dictatorship. So for me, seeing people in civilian clothes with guns, grabbing people and putting them in the cars and driving away, looking over my shoulder, that was normal. That was how you live. So yesterday's talk focused mostly on the curricular issues, because most people there were not necessarily interested in Latin America. So today's talk, I thought of doing something that merged those curricular interests with some of the things that are going on in Argentina as I see them, in terms of how the dictatorship, the period of dictatorship from the late 70s and early 80s is being taught and talked about right now. But I want to start with a little anecdote that shaped part of how I was seeing the problem at stake. And it has to do with when I went back to Argentina to do my field work in 2008, I was walking with my dad, and for the first time, I was almost 30 years old, and for the first time, I asked him, how come you, like most of the middle class in Buenos Aires, how come you lived through all that, and you still claim you had no idea what was going on?
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Daniel Friedrich. Daniel got his PhD here in campus in curriculum and instruction, and also with a minor in Latin American studies. So it's great to have alums coming back and presenting us to see what they're doing. Daniel is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching in the Teachers College at Columbia University. I've learned that he just received an Early Career Scholar Award from the American Educational Research Association, the special interest group on critical issues in curriculum and cultural studies. So congratulations on that award. Daniel's interest is in the systems of thought that travel in teacher education and the political of the knowledge of education. His talk today is titled Democratic Education as a Curricular Problem, Memory, History.
I'm the outreach coordinator for the Latin American Canada program, and very pleased you came here today, especially on this wintry day that the days that just continue to come and come, all these chilly days. But I just wanted to make a quick announcement. In the back, as you probably already noticed, we've got some light snacks and coffee and tea, so please feel free to help yourself. There's also some brochures in the corner there. We have a copy of the list of all the rest of the lunchtime lectures that we have for the remainder of the semester. Those are available, and also a listserv sign-in sheet if you're not on our listserv and you'd like to stay abreast of all of our events. There's also a handout there for a conference that's coming up that has to do with Brazil, and that's through our linkage with the Brazil Initiative project, and so that is available. So thank you very much for coming.